Now we'll have Monty Stiles to wrap up.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, thank you for giving me a few moments to talk about this issue. I stand in front of you in support of these two resolutions. It is a historic thing in the history of the United States for a legislative body to be considering something like this. I served as 28 years as a state and federal drug prosecutor. For 24 years, I was the head of the Organized Crime Drug Enforcement Task Force for the federal government. I've taught all over the United States and in foreign countries about organized crime, drug trafficking, money laundering. I've interviewed hundreds, thousands of drug users and drug traffickers, and I'm here in support of these two resolutions. And I would just like to summarize what we're doing here today in kind of a policy fashion, what the policy reasons are for considering these two resolutions and why they should be passed. You know, we experimented with drug legalization and drug normalization in the 1960s, and it continued and got worse in the 1970s. To the point where in the early 80s, mid-80s, we had enough of that. We saw the consequences of drug abuse. We saw the consequences of surrendering to the drug culture, and we fought back, and we did massive amounts of drug education, and it worked. Education works. Drug use in America dropped by over 50% and stayed that way for nearly a decade. Those numbers started to go up again in about 2009, 2010, when a 9% increase in use was attributed to by Gil Kerlikowske, who's our current federal drug czar, and many, many other experts attributed it to the normalization of marijuana in legalization states and these campaigns used to convince people that drugs do not hurt you, that we should surrender to the drug culture. And as a student of what has happened in other states, as someone who talks to people, policymakers, attorneys, other people in every state where these laws have passed, I can promise you 5 things happen when our state gets targeted by national pro-drug organizations that want Idaho to pass these laws. And that has happened. Idaho is a target. There's a current initiative that started, and other national organizations are looking at us to go with the way of other states to do this thing. And I want you to know that in those states where this happens, when you're targeted, there is a massive amount of money spent convincing the voters that drugs are okay, that marijuana in particular is not only okay, but it's medicine. Massive media campaigns. The second thing we know is our drug education coalitions and our government agencies have no money to fight back. In Washington, the pro-drug forces spent $6 million in a pro-drug media campaign. Our side had $15,599 to fight back. In Colorado, it was $3.4 million to $700,000. In Massachusetts, it's $1 million to $3,900. Increased use, massive efforts to educate people with false information. And if successful, 5 things will happen to Idaho. We will need massive regulations to put this in place. Number 2, there will be lots of time spent in legislative committees trying to figure out the messes. Number 3, massive amounts of fraud. I feel sorry for everyone here that has a medical condition, but if they want to blame someone for medical marijuana not working across America, they need to look at the recreational users who are defrauding and scamming the system so bad that it is not working anywhere. Number 4, there's a massive amount of litigation that comes with it. And number 5, a state-sanctioned system is simply in violation of federal law and causes lots of problems. The last thing I want to say is if Idaho is targeted and it is successful to be a medical marijuana state, the day it passes will be the day that the campaign for full legalization will start, because that is the goal of the national organizations. No matter what the intent of people here, that's what their goal is, full legalization. They will spend millions to have that happen. And I urge you, and I have some additional information I'll leave with one of the pages, I urge you on behalf of Idaho and especially our children that you pass these resolutions and send a message to those people who want to teach us otherwise that Idaho is too great to go to pot. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Committee, we have SCR 112 and SJM 101 before the committee.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Stennett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I perhaps have the odd position of being a representative over one district, a city in my district that has actually passed 3 initiatives for medical marijuana, low law enforcement priority, and legalizing industrial hemp. And that happened in 2007. These were not implemented because, as we've all mentioned, these are already state and federal crimes. That is not supported in state and federal law. And so if the conversation then is the crux of no matter how far do we go where we aren't putting people at risk or encouraging more use and still being able to provide the medical usage that we've been talking about here. And I do not want to diminish or dismiss the importance of that, because we have to have the sympathy for those individuals with grave medical conditions. I've had several family members and loved ones who've gone through a lot of these illnesses and cancers. Chemo can cause nausea and a loss of appetite. Malnutrition, which doctors never talk about, is a huge component of the side effect of that. The body has less ability to absorb nutrients. Marinol, which we've been talking about, is a powerful synthetic and expensive drug. But if you cannot keep food down, what is a pill going to do for you when you're throwing it back up again? The idea is that we have to remember that these people need relief, and we need to be able to feed them, and they need nutrients. We have to have the ability for them to be able to fight for themselves. And so I hope we keep that in mind when we have this conversation. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Is there other discussion on the committee? Senator Winder.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it is important to recognize that we aren't changing any laws. We're not really making it more difficult. We are having the conversation, and I think that's appropriate. We know Idaho's been targeted and will continue to be targeted by pro-marijuana groups, and we think that this is a way to bring this issue forward. The public needs to be aware of it. We wanted to be proactive in it. We didn't want to sit back and wait until there may be a petition out there and an initiative occurring, and that's the reason the Association of Idaho Cities brought it to us for consideration.
Thank you. And committee, is there a motion with respect to either
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Hill.
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the good response we've had to this. I think I was the one that suggested maybe we go ahead with the hearing so that people could express their feelings and so that we could all learn and learn from one another. And I appreciate the participation with that. I have some strong feelings about these particular issues as well. It is a passionate issue for many, but I would move Senate Concurrent Resolution 112 to the floor with a due pass recommendation.
Motion by Senator Hill, second by Senator Winder, to send SCR 112 to the floor with a due pass recommendation. Is there discussion on that motion?
Mr.
Senator
Chairman,
Work.
Mr. Chairman, first, everybody that showed up, anybody that's watching on the internet, I just think it's a great day in Idaho when we can finally have a discussion about the issue. I think this is the first time that the legislature has had the opportunity in a committee hearing to discuss the issue, and I think that's a very healthy thing for our state. I did want to comment on a few things. I know whether or not the legislature takes a stand one way or another on the issue, the people have a funny way of telling us what they think, and the initiative process is a critical piece of that, and I encourage the use of the initiative process for people to do what they think needs to get done, and hopefully that's used well. I also wanted to, Mr. Chairman, state that the way that medical marijuana initiatives have gone around the country, I don't support them. My wife's a physician. I don't want her placed in a position of basically fraudulently writing prescriptions for people that have headaches and backaches that can't be documented. So the way that medical marijuana has been done throughout the country and in different states, I don't support those efforts because they aren't specific enough about when medical marijuana can be used. And I'm not saying that I'd oppose medical marijuana if there was something very specific and the sideboards were very tight. But currently the way it's being done across the country as a means really, I think, of decriminalizing without saying decriminalizing, I think is not honest. And I think we need to be honest when we have these discussions. Mr. Chairman, one of the things that stood out in testimony today, besides contradictory information on both sides, is the interesting impact of making substances illegal and creating black markets that you don't control, that you can't regulate. And when we compare and contrast with alcohol, I think it's a very interesting kind of comparison because in the case of marijuana, we've simply created a black market with organized crime and violence that we see, especially in Mexico, associated with that. It's interesting that no place in the discussion today has personal responsibility really come up. I know that in the legislature we talk a lot about personal responsibility, taking responsibility for your actions, not having a nanny government, not getting involved deeply in your personal lives, because we want to trust that the people are going to take personal responsibility, and we want to give them the opportunity for that. Here I see bills that basically seek to not provide the opportunity for the public to have and exercise personal responsibility. And I think it's kind of interesting that it didn't come up today. The other thing that is interesting to note is the idea in this particular instance of giving up our own responsibility as a state to the federal government to enforce laws that we may or may not feel are just. In some instances, we seem to depend on the federal government to come and enforce the law. In other instances, we seem to decide that we don't want the federal government to enforce the law in our state. So I just wanted to point that out. I won't be supporting the motion, partly because I'm not a fan of the way it's written, but also partly because I think that it's probably premature at this stage for us to be acting on these resolutions and concurrent, whatever they are. I've got a concurrent resolution and a joint memorial. But I do, again, very much appreciate, Mr. Chairman, your holding a hearing. I appreciate the comments from the committee today, and I really appreciate the public's input today. It's been, I think, a very valuable experience for all of us.
Thank you. Thank you for your debate, Senator. We're debating the motion on SCR 112. Is there further discussion? Then all in favor of the motion, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed, nay. The ayes have it. Committee, we still have SGM 101.
Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry.